When I pulled into my driveway after a 2-week fishing trip in Alaska, the first thing I noticed was the wide, open view of my backyard and the sudden absence of my 6-foot wooden privacy fence. At first, I thought I was hallucinating from jet lag. But no, it was gone. Every last panel. Torn out clean, like it had never been there. My blood pressure started to spike before I'd even turned off the ignition. That's when I saw her. Eloise Markham, HOA president. Standing smugly on the sidewalk with a clipboard and a hot pink visor that practically screamed, "I ruin lives for leisure." Middle-aged, sunglasses too big for her face, and lips pursed like she just tasted sour milk. I stepped out of my truck and gave her a look. "Eloise," I said slowly, "where the hell is my fence?" She didn't even blink. "Nathan McClure, your fence violated Article 7, Section D of the HOA guidelines. It was 1 inch over the height limit and extended 3 feet past your property line. We issued you a warning." "I was on vacation," I said, still trying to process the fact that she had the gall to stand there like she hadn't just committed blatant property destruction. "You should have checked your mail," she said, tilting her head. "We gave you 72 hours to rectify the issue. When you didn't, the HOA hired a contractor to remove it. You're being fined also, just so you know." I could barely speak. "You cut down my fence without my permission while I was out of state." She actually laughed. "It's not your call when it violates community standards. We have full authority, Nathan." I gritted my teeth. "You trespassed and destroyed private property. That's not authority, that's illegal." "Careful," she said, wagging a finger. "You're starting to sound hostile." "Any threats and I'll have security involved." There was no security. It was just her son-in-law who walked around with a walkie-talkie and a beer gut, but I knew better than to argue. Not right then. Instead, I nodded. "Cool. Appreciate the warm welcome home." She smiled like she'd won something. "We're all about community here, Nathan." I didn't say another word. I walked inside, poured myself a drink, and stared out at the gaping hole where my fence used to be. My backyard now looked directly into Eloise's perfectly manicured patio, complete with a fountain, gnome army, and a sign that read HOA royalty. I had no intention of rebuilding the fence. I was going to build a wall. I didn't sleep that night. I sat at my kitchen table with a legal pad, a pot of coffee, and a slow burning rage that kept me wired until dawn. I wasn't going to let this slide. I'd spent 8 years in the Army Corps of Engineers building forward operating bases in worse conditions than this suburban wasteland. If Eloise thought she could bulldoze me like some scared retiree, she had another thing coming. First light, I drove to city zoning records. I needed my property lines official ones, not the garbage printouts the HOA used to bluff homeowners. The clerk, an older guy with a ponytail and a thermos that smelled like beef stew, pulled everything I needed after I gave him my parcel number. I paid for certified copies, then asked him a question that had been burning in my brain all night. If someone removes part of a structure on private property without the owner's consent, what's the city's stance? He scratched his cheek and leaned in. "You talking about a neighbor dispute, HOA," I said. He whistled low. "They're not law enforcement. They don't have demolition rights unless it's in writing and signed. What if it's not? Then it's criminal trespass and destruction of property. You should file a report." I drove straight to the precinct. Officer Delgado took the report. Big guy, calm energy, probably used to domestic disputes and board thieves. He listened without interrupting, read over the documents, and nodded. "You've got a case," he said. "She can't authorize a teardown without a court order or your written consent. Especially if it's on your property. She claims it crossed the line." "Did it?" I handed him the survey map. "Here's the kicker, it didn't." She lied. He opened his desk drawer and pulled out a small digital recorder. "You willing to make a formal statement?" "Absolutely." By the time I got home, a patrol car was already parked across the street. Eloise stood on her porch, arms crossed, watching the officer speak with her husband, who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. I didn't wave. I just parked in my driveway and began unloading the supplies I'd picked up on the way back. 5 pallets of concrete blocks, reinforced steel mesh, rebar, and a rented cement mixer on a flatbed trailer. I didn't build a fence. I built a retaining wall 6 feet high, solid concrete, with a smooth stucco finish and a decorative stone cap, perfectly within code. It didn't require HOA approval because it wasn't classified as a fence. It was a landscape feature. I'd confirmed it with the city's planning department before I bought a single brick. It took me 4 days. I worked sunrise to sunset, no music, no breaks. Neighbors slowed their cars to watch. A few nodded in approval. A couple brought me sandwiches. Eloise didn't say a word until the final day. She marched across the street in wedge heels and a cardigan that looked like it cost more than my monthly mortgage. Her mouth opened before she even reached the edge of my lawn. "What exactly do you think you're doing?" I didn't look up. I was smoothing mortar with a trowel. "Building a wall. You can't just throw up a monstrosity in the middle of the community. It's not in the middle. It's on my property, verified by the city. I've got permits if you'd like to see them. You're creating a hostile environment." I set the trowel down and faced her. "You destroyed my property. You didn't apologize, didn't ask. You lied about boundaries. Now you're upset because I'm protecting what's mine. You're retaliating?" "No," I said, pointing to the wall. "I'm fortifying." She jabbed a finger toward the concrete. "That's not a fence." "That's a barrier." "Exactly. And your bylaws only regulate fences. This isn't covered." I walked over to the edge of the wall where I had embedded a bronze plaque. "See that?" She leaned closer, squinting. Then her face flushed. It read, "Private property, no trespassing. Constructed in response to unauthorized demolition on August 9th. Surveillance in use. You're going to ruin the neighborhood. I'm going to protect it from people like you." She stormed off, muttering something about emergency meetings and special sessions. I didn't care. I had concrete curing in the sun and a camera system recording every inch of the yard. Let her try something. 2 days later, I received a certified letter from the HOA demanding immediate removal of the wall. It cited visual disharmony and unauthorized construction. I wrote back with a notarized statement, a copy of the zoning code, and a single sentence. "You have no jurisdiction over landscape structures under Municipal Code 14.3. I didn't hear back for a week. Then came the petition. Eloise went door to door, trying to rally support to force me into compliance. But the thing about power-hungry people like her is they forget the goodwill of the community matters more than any clipboard. Turns out, a lot of people had stories. An elderly couple who got fined for planting tomatoes too close to the sidewalk. A single mom who'd been harassed over the color of her window blinds. Even the guy with the gnome army had been warned over excessive whimsy. I hosted a barbecue that Saturday. Free food, cold drinks, and a printed stack of HOA grievance forms people could fill out on the spot. I also had a notary present. By the end of the night, I had 27 signatures calling for a special vote to remove Eloise from her position. I submitted the packet to the HOA board 4 other members, all of whom had been rubber stamping her decisions for years. But now they were nervous. They saw what was happening. They saw the neighborhood shifting. The board called for a public meeting the following Wednesday. I showed up early and sat in the front row. Eloise arrived late, trying to look unbothered, but her hands trembled as she sorted her notes. The community room at the local library was packed, standing room only. People weren't whispering anymore. They were ready to talk. I didn't need to say a word. The neighbors did it for me. One by one, they stood up and told their stories, each one a nail in the coffin of her credibility. When someone mentioned the police report I'd filed, there was a ripple of gasps. Then Officer Delgado himself walked in. He'd been subpoenaed to testify about the complaint. He confirmed the investigation was ongoing and that the HOA president could be held personally liable for damages since she authorized the removal. Eloise tried to speak, but the board voted to suspend her pending the outcome of the legal process. Her face was pale. Her voice cracked as she tried to protest, but no one was listening anymore. When I walked out of the library, people clapped me on the back. Some even hugged me. I just smiled and said, "Let's fix this neighborhood." Because the wall wasn't about revenge. It was about boundaries and making sure no one like her ever thought they could cross them again. 3 days after the meeting at the library, a letter landed in my mailbox that made my stomach tighten, not out of fear, but out of anticipation. It was from the city's code enforcement office. The envelope was thin but official. I opened it at the kitchen counter, half expecting some last-ditch effort from Eloise's cronies to challenge the wall. What I found instead was a notice that a formal investigation had been opened into several code violations committed by the HOA, specifically unauthorized property modification, misuse of power, and failure to follow due process. Attached was a request for a formal interview, not just with me, but with any residents who had grievances supported by documentation. I had plenty, and I knew at least a dozen neighbors who were already organizing their own folders. By that afternoon, I'd turned my garage into mission control. Fold-out tables lined with manila folders, labeled by household. I bought a cheap printer from the office store and set up a scanner. People came in shifts, dropping off letters, photos, emails, even security footage. One guy had a voicemail saved from Eloise threatening to revoke lawn privileges if he didn't remove his solar lights. Another had a typed notice demanding he repaint his door because red was too aggressive for the community's tone. I created a timeline of events, detailing what happened to my fence and everything that followed. I included receipts for the new materials, the permit numbers, the full copy of the zoning ordinance and Delgado's report number. I didn't embellish anything. I didn't have to. The day before my interview with the city investigator, I got a call from a number I didn't recognize. A woman's voice came through measured, professional, and unmistakably not from around here. My name is Joanne Rivas, Deputy District Attorney for the county. We've received a referral from the Municipal Code Office regarding potential criminal activity involving your HOA. I'd like to schedule a time to speak with you directly. I sat on the edge of the couch, every sense alert. You're investigating the HOA itself. We're evaluating whether the president and any acting members knowingly engaged in unlawful property seizure, trespassing, and potential fraud related to community funds. That last part was news. Fraud? There's a discrepancy between what was budgeted for the fence removal and the contractor's invoice. It's a significant one. I paused. How significant? Over $17,000. That explained the new landscaping around Eloise's driveway. And the custom awning on her back patio. I agreed to meet the next morning at her office downtown. The room was sterile and quiet, the kind of place where truth didn't get debated, it got recorded. Rivas had a file already open in front of her when I arrived. She didn't waste time with small talk. Did you ever receive a copy of the contractor's removal order or invoice? No, I said, and I asked for it. I was told it wasn't my concern since the HOA covered the expense. She tilted the folder so I could see a scanned document. This is the invoice submitted to the HOA board. It lists a demolition crew, 2 days of labor, debris removal, and a rental fee for specialized equipment, nearly $21,000 total. I looked at the breakdown. There were 2 teenagers with a pickup and a chainsaw. Took them less than 4 hours. That's what we thought. She slid another set of papers across. This is the actual payment to the contractor, $4,200. The rest was billed to administrative facilitation. That check went to a company registered last year. Owner listed as Eloise Markham. Her son, correct. I leaned back. You've got her. We have enough to begin formal proceedings, Rivas said, but we're building a broader case. We need statements from residents, especially if they've paid fines or been threatened with enforcement action that wasn't backed by code. They'll talk, I said. They're ready, she nodded. Good, because this is going to court. By the following week, subpoenas began landing in mailboxes. The HOA board held a closed-door emergency session, but it didn't matter. The whispers had turned into a storm. The neighborhood listserv lit up. Someone started a shared drive with scanned records of past fines. Another neighbor, a retired tax consultant, dug into the HOA's budget reports and found more discrepancies, landscaping charges that didn't match what was actually done, payments for security patrols that never existed, and even a reimbursement for a community outreach dinner that turned out to be a reservation for Eloise's birthday at a steakhouse 2 cities over. The board fractured. One by one, members resigned, claiming ignorance or that they'd been manipulated. But nobody bought it. They'd signed off on it all, and the residents didn't forget. The day the charges were formally announced, local news vans parked along the neighborhood entrance. A reporter tried to approach Eloise as she left her house, but she slammed the door of her SUV and sped off. Her husband had moved out 3 days earlier. Her son's contracting company was already under audit. I watched it all from my porch, sipping sweet tea and flipping through a binder of the HOA's original charter. Buried in the bylaws was a clause that had been ignored for years. In the event of board-wide resignation or removal, the neighborhood had the right to vote in an interim council from among the residents for a full reassessment of all standing rules. We wasted no time. The same people she'd tried to control were now the ones rewriting everything. No more rules about curtain colors. No more threats over garden gnomes or the shape of a mailbox. The new charter focused on safety, transparency, and basic maintenance. We even voted to cap fines and require a 2/3 majority for any enforcement action. At the final meeting of the year, I was asked to speak. Standing at the front of the community center, I looked at the rows of neighbors people who had once barely waved at each other, but now shared notes, meals, and weekend projects. This started because someone thought power meant control, I said. But power without accountability is just bullying. What we did here wasn't just about a wall. It was about drawing a line and making sure no one crosses it again. There was no applause, just a quiet, collective agreement that settled over the room like a fresh start. Eloise's trial was scheduled for the spring. She faced multiple counts of fraud, property damage, and abuse of authority. The DA told me the evidence was airtight. She wouldn't be returning to the neighborhood. Her house went up for sale in January, and the listing quietly removed any mention of HOA amenities. The wall still stands. Clean, untagged, and completely legal. I planted ivy along the base, and by summer, it'll be green and blooming. Not to hide anything, but to remind us all that sometimes the strongest thing you can do isn't tear something down. It's to build something no bully can take away. The first sign that Eloise Markham wasn't just an overbearing HOA president, but something far more dangerous came not from the courtroom, but from a dusty storage unit on the edge of town. It was mid-February, and Eric, the same retired tax consultant who'd uncovered the financial inconsistencies in the HOA budget, called me to meet him at a facility off Route 7. He'd been quietly following a trail of documents the city hadn't caught yet. We stood in front of a corrugated metal door as he jiggled a lock open. "You're not going to believe what I found," he said, lifting the door. Inside, stacked high and deep, were boxes labeled with years and street names. HOA records going back over a decade. Not scanned, not digitized, just stuffed in boxes like someone was hoping they'd be forgotten. Eric had tracked the payments for the unit back to an account tied to Eloise's name through a shell company she'd used for community storage. "She kept physical records off-site?" I asked, grabbing one of the boxes marked 2018 Compliance and Enforcement. "Records that never made it into official HOA filings," Eric said. "There are entire folders here with handwritten notes. Look at this one." He handed me a file with the name of a couple who'd moved out 2 years ago, quiet folks who left suddenly after a spat with the board. Inside were photos taken from inside their backyard, complaints about non-compliant behavior, and a payment ledger showing a cash withdrawal from HOA funds listed as special resolution expense. "You think she paid someone off?" I asked. Eric nodded. "Or worse." We spent 4 hours photographing everything before calling the deputy assigned to the case. 2 days later, the DA's office added tampering with records and misappropriation of community funds to the charges already pending. It didn't stop there. The investigation widened when a local contractor came forward. A man named Dennis Morales, who had once done legitimate landscaping for the HOA, admitted to being paid under the table by Eloise personally to handle properties that were deemed problematic. Handle, in this case, meant cutting power to exterior lights, dumping fertilizer on non-HOA-approved plants, and in one case, breaking a sprinkler system so the homeowner would be cited for water waste. He testified under oath that she'd instructed him to make it look like wear and tear. When asked why he agreed, he said he needed the money and didn't think anyone would believe him if he came forward alone. As more came to light, the judge overseeing the case approved a motion to allow the community to formally dissolve the HOA under a clause in the state residential governance code that permitted disbandment in cases of systemic abuse. A temporary administrator was appointed to oversee the transition, and the residents voted to restructure as a voluntary neighborhood association, one with no enforcement power and full financial transparency. By March, Eloise's assets had been frozen. Her bank accounts, her car, even her investment property in another county, everything was under audit. The prosecutor's office revealed that the HOA had been used not just for personal gain, but as a funnel for fraudulent insurance claims and padded invoices. She'd been running a small-scale racket under the guise of neighborhood beautification. The charges now included wire fraud, racketeering, falsification of public documents, and conspiracy to commit property damage. The trial was scheduled for the third week of April, and the courtroom was packed on the first day. Not just with residents, but reporters, legal observers, even a few former HOA board members who had flipped and now sat with the prosecution. I was called to the stand on day 2. The prosecutor, a sharp-eyed woman named Lynn Carter, handed me a photo of my backyard, the one taken the day I returned from Alaska, the fence missing, Eloise standing in the background like she was posing for a magazine titled Dictators in Suburbia. Mr. McClure, did you give anyone permission to remove your fence? No, I didn't. Did you receive any documentation from the HOA or its president authorizing this removal prior to it happening? Nothing. No warning, no notice. I came home and found it gone. Did you later confirm that the fence was within your property line? Yes, I had certified surveys from the city zoning office. The fence was entirely on my land. And did you file a police report regarding this incident? I did. Officer Delgado took the report. He also confirmed that no demolition permit had been filed. Have you had any communication with Miss Markham since then? Not directly. She attempted to issue a fine and then petitioned for the removal of the structure I built in response. What was that structure? A concrete privacy wall. Fully permitted and compliant with city code. And why did you build it? To protect my property and my privacy, and to send a message that I wouldn't be intimidated. The defense tried to paint me as retaliatory, suggesting that the wall was a hostile act intended to provoke. But Carter shut it down by producing the zoning documents, the permit, and a timeline of events that clearly showed the wall went up only after all legal channels had been followed. By the end of the week, the jury had heard from 10 residents, each with their own story of harassment, unauthorized enforcement, and financial penalties that had no legal basis. One woman had bank statements showing she'd paid over $6,000 in compliance fees, none of which were ever recorded in the HOA's official budget. The turning point came when the city's auditor took the stand and produced a 24-page report detailing how Eloise had created a network of fake vendors and shell companies. She'd submitted dozens of invoices for services never rendered: tree trimming, pest control, irrigation repair, and directed the payments to accounts she controlled under false business names. The courtroom was silent when the numbers were read aloud. Over $170,000 in total fraud, spread over 5 years. The jury returned a unanimous verdict after just 3 hours, guilty on all counts. The judge handed down the sentence that same afternoon: 15 years in state prison, with no possibility of parole for the first 7. Eloise didn't speak during sentencing. She stared ahead, expression blank, hands clasped tightly in front of her like she was still waiting for someone to follow her orders. Outside the courthouse, residents gathered in a circle. Not to celebrate, but to acknowledge the end of something that had held them hostage with rules, citations, and fear. There was no cheering, just quiet relief. A week later, the neighborhood held its first block party in years, no permits. No restrictions on music volume or how many chairs could be on a lawn. Kids ran around with water guns. Someone grilled burgers in a driveway. A local band set up a couple of amps and played until the streetlights came on. I stood by the wall, the same one that had started everything, and watched as ivy crept up over the stone cap. It had taken hold faster than I expected. Soon it would cover the entire face, softening the edges without hiding what it was. People came by in small groups, not to gawk, but to admire. One man, a quiet veteran who'd lived 2 doors down for years without much interaction, nodded toward it. "You built that yourself?" "Every brick," I said. He nodded again. "Good, we needed something solid around here." I didn't respond. I just watched the ivy sway in the breeze and listened to the laughter down the street. The wall had never been about keeping people out. It had been about keeping something toxic from spreading any further. And now, it finally had.